A racist cop slammed a 62-year-old black woman against a brick wall. Her Bible hit the ground before she did. He never asked her name. And in less than 5 seconds, her husband, one of the most powerful federal judges in the state, stepped out of a black SUV. But by then, it was already too late. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow, we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. Naomi Ellison rose from her pew as the church bells of St. Mark's Baptist finished their Sunday refrain, each chime a gentle exhale of worship and memory. She held her Bible, its leather cover worn soft by decades of prayer meetings, mentorship sessions, and quiet evenings spent turning yellowed pages under lamplight. In her other hand, a bouquet of white lilies bound with pale blue ribbon swayed lightly at her side. Below her collar, a silver dove brooch caught the reflection of stained glass hues, a silent testament to survival and hope. She stepped onto the sun-warmed stone steps that led out of the sanctuary, surrounded by families returning to the world beyond those sacred walls. Children darted between towering columns, laughter rising like small birds. Elders paused to exchange blessings. Naomi's gait was deliberate and serene. She wasn't escaping. She was claiming space, grounded in decades of devotion and service. The lilies pressed against her leg with gentle weight, their petals poised to mark memory as she made her weekly pilgrimage. At Hawthorne Street's curb, magnolia blossoms hung heavy in breeze-stirred clusters, their sweet scent heavy with childhood summers. Naomi inhaled it deeply and considered her path home, a short 2-block walk past blooming hedges and familiar porches. Each brick of her flagstone path had known her footfalls. That pale blue ribbon had brushed its edges before. Over 30 years, this routine had become an unspoken ritual. Light a candle for her husband on their anniversary, cook a meal, even alone, and breathe into memory the kind of strength rooted in stillness. She crossed the street, lilies steady in her arm, Bible at her side, steps softened by jasmine's climbing tendrils and the rose bushes she pruned each spring. Naomi's pace slowed as she reached her white-painted cottage with its green shutters. The porch, her sanctuary, beckoned. Each crack in the paint and weathered step told stories of conversation shared, lessons taught, quiet solidarity formed on quiet evenings. Naomi paused at the gate, hand poised over the latch like a sentinel. Hers was not the stillness of fear, but of fierce presence. She eased the gate open and lifted each lily carefully onto the small table beside her rocking chair. She smoothed the hem of her crepe dress, pressed her Bible to her side, and let eyes absorb the details. The chipped rail, the rose petals fallen in shadow, the sunlight painting patches of warmth across the worn mat. In that moment, something shifted. The air, once honeyed with magnolias, stilled. Naomi drew a breath, silent, measured, and anchored her heart. Sunday ritual had settled into place, but in the hush beneath it, a tremor of tension hinted at an unbidden guest, a suspicion long known but rarely invited. Still, she held her posture proud, her face calm, ready in a way that comes only from years of knowing both grace and judgment. Naomi never hurried, not on Sundays, not on her anniversary. The weight of the lilies in her hand was more than symbolic. It was a vow, carried across seasons, to honor something sacred, no matter how the world shifted around her. Each year she walked the same path, from St. Mark's back to the cottage she had shared with Jemiah. Even on the years when he couldn't be there, it wasn't tradition for tradition's sake. It was memory made visible, a ritual to anchor the present in the soil of the past. She passed a rusted mailbox covered in ivy, smiled faintly at the sound of wind chimes 2 doors down, each tone familiar, like the voice of an old friend. Her heels clicked gently against the sidewalk, punctuated by bird song and the faint rustle of leaves. A breeze swept the hem of her dress across her calves. She adjusted the brooch at her collarbone, letting her fingers rest for a second on the dove's silver wings. It had been Jeremiah's anniversary gift to her in year 10, when they were still paying off law school loans and drinking instant coffee on the porch. The quiet today felt almost reverent to me. Naomi felt it in the bones first, a stillness that didn't belong. Her pace didn't change, but her senses heightened, the way they always did when something unseen settled nearby. She glanced toward the corner without turning her head fully. That's when she saw the cruiser. It was parked across the street, angled slightly, as though someone wanted a clear view down the sidewalk. Engine idling. No sirens, no flashing lights, just presence. The kind that lingered. The kind you don't mistake for coincidence. A white man sat behind the wheel, head tilted, elbow on the door, staring. Naomi kept walking, her face unreadable. She had learned long ago that reaction could be mistaken for guilt, that dignity could be redefined by someone else's fear. She adjusted her grip on the lilies, firmer now. The sidewalk beneath her feet felt narrower than it had a block ago. The magnolias overhead felt taller, leaning in. Her mind moved swiftly through her internal checklist. ID? In her purse. Phone? Charged. Gate to the church? Locked behind her. Nothing out of place. She hadn't done anything wrong, but then, doing nothing wrong had never been a guarantee. She remembered her mother's words, once whispered late at night during the early days of busing. They don't need a reason, baby, just the wrong moment and the right excuse. She took a breath and kept walking. The houses close. The light would flick on when she stepped up the porch. Jeremiah had programmed it that way last year, just in case. Just in case what? This. A movement flickered at the edge of her vision. The cruiser's door creaked open, the sounds slicing through birdsong. Naomi didn't turn around. She let the moment stretch, let the weight of it press against her shoulders, just enough to remind her this world still hadn't figured out how to see her clearly. She let her shoulders stay squared, let the lilies sway at her side like banners in a silent march, let the ritual continue, even as the air around her tensed into something she hadn't invited, but knew far too well. "Ma'am," the voice came, sharp, uninvited, not loud, but loud enough to fracture the quiet. Naomi stopped. Slowly, the lilies dipped slightly as she adjusted her grip. She turned just enough to meet the voice with her eyes, the soft folds of her dress catching the light like brushed silk. The officer was closer now, about 10 feet away, mid-30. Face. White. The kind of face that held a permanent squint, like the world never quite made sense unless it was under his boot. "Your officer?" Naomi's voice was steady. She didn't smile, didn't soften her posture. She offered no excuse for her presence. The man took a step closer, one hand on his belt, the other loosely at his side. His eyes moved. "Where you headed?" Naomi met his gaze. "Home." "You come from church?" "I did." His nostrils flared slightly. "You live around here?" She didn't flinch. "I've lived on this block longer than you've worn that badge." The shift was nearly imperceptible, but she saw it, his jaw tight now, his shoulders squared, his pride pricked by plain truth. Naomi knew what this was. It wasn't about lilies or scripture. It wasn't about protocol or safety. This was performance. This was possession. And somewhere between her calm and his confusion, the script was slipping. "I need to see some ID," he said finally. Naomi blinked once. "Have I broken any laws, officer?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes flicked once more to the brooch. A dove, silver, defiant. "There was a call," he said. "Someone casing homes a few blocks down. You match the description." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "You mean a woman in church clothes holding lilies and a Bible?" "I still need to verify." "And do you ask every black woman who walks home after church to verify where she belongs?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No answer, just silence and the faint buzz of attention gathering. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't move, but something shifted in the stillness. A kind of moral gravity pulled the sidewalk into two poles, one of fear, one of dignity. And Naomi stood precisely in the center, refusing to yield either way. "My name," she said softly, "is Naomi Ellison." And for the first time, the officer blinked. The name registered. Not completely, not yet, but something about it made him pause. He took a breath, but instead of retreating, he stepped closer. 2 feet now. the smell of aftershave, the weight of history. His voice dropped. "I need you to stop walking and show me your identification. Now." Naomi stood perfectly still. Her fingers gripped the lilies tight, not out of fear, but to keep from trembling. She didn't shake because she was afraid of him. She didn't shake because she doubted herself. She shook because she had survived too long, had walked too far, to let this moment pass quietly into the archives of humiliation. "If you don't have reasonable suspicion," she said, "you have no legal grounds to detain me." The last word hadn't even finished leaving her lips before he moved. The cruiser sat like a dark sentinel beneath magnolia shadows, its engine silent but presence heavy. Naomi paused in her steps, clutching lilies close against her chest, as she crossed the threshold into the calm of her own street. The driver's window was down, but no siren, no spotlight. Just that unnerving stillness. A man inside leaned forward, elbow resting on the car door, watching her every move with an intensity that felt accusatory, even intimate. That quiet gaze landed on Naomi like a stone, weighing beneath her collarbone. She didn't flinch. Years of walking these blocks had taught her when to stand firm and when to fold away. Golden blossoms drifted through humid air. A sparrow piped overhead. All comfort signs, but Naomi's internal compass had already shifted. This wasn't peaceful anymore. It was charged. Her breath slowed, her heart anchored to steady rhythm. She lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance, simply in recognition that dignity begins at posture. With each step toward home, she ran through the silent validation checklist she had learned long ago. Phone on, battery full, ID reachable, mind grounded. The Bible rested at her side like an oath. The white lilies trembled in her arms, symbolizing both grace and fragility. No matter what unfolded, Naomi carried her truth like armor. The cruiser's tires shifted. Naomi heard the minute scrape of rubber against pavement, an unseen signal. She crossed in front of a wrought iron gate that led to her small cottage. Peeling white paint, stone steps, elements of sanctuary. But the presence of that car turned her path into a gauntlet. Afternoon light blinked through the magnolias overhead, dappling her dove brooch into brief glints of resilience. Naomi reminded herself that coming home was an act of continuation, of memory, of quiet strength. Another footstep, the weight behind it shifted. Without turning, Naomi sensed the movement, the driver exiting, approaching. Humanity and threat mingled in the air. She'd faced worse, being black, being a woman, being visible in spaces designed to erase, but this felt new, in a way that cut deeper. Protocol performed as suspicion as default, a threat in plain view, dressed up as routine. She stopped at the gate's threshold, her familiar edges underhand. Her silhouette stood firm against that slow, green lawn. The tension began to hum in her bones. What began as routine checks often spiraled into control for people like her. An officer's presence on your porch could escalate into violence in seconds. Still, Naomi didn't rush or retreat. She refused to yield her narrative. The steps behind her, the single approach of a white, uniformed stranger, were not enough to rattle her dignity. She breathed in the scent of magnolia and brimstone, exhaling calm. No procedure would steal her peace. Inside the gate, she could see the porch table waiting, ritual on her Sunday path, mug of cold water, an open notebook of memories. But today, she held her lilies tight. She was home, but not safe. Across the street, the officer paused mid-step, clipboard in hand, presuming suspicion. Naomi adjusted her hold on her things. In that pregnant quiet, she had learned to wield. Responsibility shifted. The threat's tension hovered unspoken, uninvited. But she was unbowed, unwavering. Because she was home, and dignity isn't optional. Naomi stood steady, one hand on the garden gate, the other still clutching her lilies. The petals fluttered slightly in the breeze, catching the fading light. Her spine was straight, her expression calm. She didn't need to turn around to know the officer was closer now. Maybe 2 sidewalk squares away. The sound of his boots was deliberate, paced, professional. but there was something behind the rhythm, something searching. She turned slowly, giving the officer a full, unobstructed view. Her face was unbothered but alert, like someone who knew the rules but also knew what happened when those rules were rewritten in real time. The man before her was in his late 30s, white, lean but broad-shouldered, with a nameplate that read C. Fletcher. His sunglasses were perched on top of his head now, revealing pale blue eyes that flicked between her hands and her. He looked cautious, but not the kind of caution that protected others. It was the kind of caution that sought control. "Ma'am," he began with a practiced voice, "I'm Officer Fletcher with the Midtown District. May I ask what you're doing on this property?" Naomi didn't blink. She met his question with the kind of pause that demanded reflection. "This property," she said slowly, her voice clear and gentle, "is my home." There was no tremor in her words. The wind nudged the corner of her shawl across her shoulder. Fletcher hesitated, clearly not expecting her tone. Or maybe not expecting her poise. "We had a call," he continued, "about a suspicious individual walking near windows, peering in, matching your description." Naomi raised an eyebrow but didn't move. "I've lived here for over 30 years. I walk this route every Sunday. I come from church. I carry flowers for my late husband. I'm not suspicious, officer. I'm consistent." He shifted slightly, as if her calm made him uneasy. His hand remained nervously on his utility belt, not quite resting on it, but close enough to remind her who had the taser, the baton, and the badge. Naomi didn't look away. She'd seen men like him her entire life. Men who interpreted her composure as challenge. Fletcher cleared his throat. "I understand that, ma'am, but do you have identification on you?" "I do," she answered, and gently set the lilies down on the bench near her porch steps. "In my purse. May I reach for it?" That simple question. How many times had she coached young women in the church to ask it out loud before moving? Consent for survival, permission in your own yard. "Ye," he said, with the nod of someone trying to retain control. Naomi moved carefully, slowly. She opened her purse, pulled out her leather wallet, and handed over her driver's license. The officer took it and stepped back, glancing down. His eyes moved quickly, then paused. She watched his jaw shift. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Confusion? Her license bore the name Naomi Ellison. She didn't say a word. She let him do the math. His brow furrowed slightly. "Thank you," he said after a pause. But the suspicion didn't leave his voice. It just slipped under the surface. And Naomi knew. This wasn't about her ID. It was about the story in his head. The one that couldn't fathom a woman like her living here, dressed like that, walking home from church, without some kind of catch. She folded her hands. She waited, letting him decide what came next. And somewhere deep in her ribs, Naomi felt it. The air wasn't clearing. It was thickening. Officer Fletcher handed the ID back, but not without hesitation. His fingers lingered just long enough for Naomi to feel it. Not the pause of protocol, but the weight of decision. He studied her again, as though trying to decode a mystery that wasn't there. Naomi accepted the license calmly and returned it to her wallet. She had done nothing wrong, and yet the moment thickened, dragging on like a stalled summer thunderstorm. Fletcher shifted his stance. "Do you live here alone, ma'am?" It was an odd question, and Naomi knew it. She tilted her head slightly. "I do." He scribbled something on a notepad he'd pulled from his back pocket. The pen moved fast, a blur of lines and loops that seemed more performative than necessary. Naomi watched him with the stillness of someone who'd learned not to feed discomfort with words. He looked up, just trying to make sure everything's in order. "Like I said, someone called in." Naomi held her gaze steady. "And did they mention I was carrying lilies and a Bible?" He blinked. "No, ma'am." "Then I'd suggest their call might have said more about them than about me." It landed, not as a barb, but as a truth too clean to ignore. His mouth opened sliding, then closed. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. A breeze moved through the trees. The magnolia branches swayed like an audience, holding their collective breath. The porch creaked behind her, a familiar, faithful sound. This was still her home, still her ground. Fletcher tapped his pen against the pad. His voice softened, but not with apology. "You understand?" he said. "In times like these, we can't take chances." Naomi's hands rested lightly on the porch rail. "I've never been a chance, officer. I've always been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's neighbor, and right now, I'm someone trying to go inside her own home without being treated like a suspect." The words hung between them, not angry, just precise. His mouth twitched, as if to speak again, but he stopped. Maybe he sensed the moment slipping. Maybe he felt eyes on him. Naomi knew neighbors had begun to peek from behind curtains. The neighborhood had grown quiet in that peculiar way tension spreads. Invisible but unmistakable. He cleared his throat. "Right. Well, you're free to go about your day, ma'am." She gave a single nod. "Thank you." But she didn't move. Not until he did. He turned slowly, walking back toward the cruiser. No sudden movements. No words exchanged. Just the widening distance between suspicion and truth. Naomi waited until the door of the cruiser closed behind him. Only then did she turn toward her porch. Her movements fluid, dignified. She picked up the lilies, cradling them once more in her arms. The scent of them rose like a... She unlocked her front door and stepped inside. But even as the latch clicked shut behind her, she felt it in her spine. This wasn't over. There had been no shouting, no violence, but something had been planted, something that would grow. And outside, in the quiet heat of a Sunday afternoon, a cruiser sat just a few minutes too long before pulling away. Naomi stood motionless on the threshold of her porch, one hand resting lightly on the worn wooden post, the lilies she had carried now gently laid upon the swing to her left. She had just returned to the house when she heard it again, that slow, deliberate step. The cruiser hadn't pulled off, it had lingered. The door creaked. A second approach. Same officer, same stare, but something different in the walk. More sure, less curious. She turned with grace, her posture composed like the pews she had just left. The breeze whispered against the lace edges of her blouse. Officer Fletcher approached again, his boots crunching lightly against gravel, his form casting a longer shadow than before. "Ma'am," he said, voice flatter now, "where are you headed?" Naomi didn't blink. "Into my house," she said plainly. "The house I just unlocked." He paused, shifting slightly. "I'll need to see your ID again." Naomi tilted her head. "You saw it 5 minutes ago. You read it. You wrote it down." "It's procedure," he said. "When a suspicious person call comes in, we document everything." She clasped her hands. "And do you often revisit people you've already cleared, officer?" His jaw tightened. "Are you refusing to comply?" Naomi didn't raise her voice. She simply moved back toward her purse, resting near the porch swing. "I'm asking you to reflect on why you're still here." His fingers hovered near his belt, an instinctive signal. Not threat, not yet, but warning. Naomi saw it, read it, filed it away. She took out her license again, slowly, deliberately, with the grace of someone who had explained the Constitution to generations of Sunday school students, not as theory, but survival. He snatched it quickly this time, less ceremony, more urgency. His eyes scanned it, her face, the ID, her face again. "You didn't answer me," she said, voice still soft. "Why are you still here?" He said nothing for a beat too long. Then, "Just being thorough." Naomi nodded slowly. "Then be thorough, not oppressive." The porch seemed to shrink between them. That narrow distance where power tests itself. Naomi didn't move, didn't fold. She stood with the poise of someone who had walked in marches, baked casseroles for grieving mothers, and read Psalm 23 by hospital beds at midnight. and across the street, behind a row of hedges, a screen door creaked open. A neighbor with a phone, watching. Officer Fletcher looked down at the license in his hand again, as if trying to find something wrong with it. Naomi stood still, watching him with the patience of someone who had endured these types of moments too many times before. The patience wasn't passive. It was sharpened, deliberate. She knew what it meant when people like her were asked to explain their presence, again and again, even on their own porch. "I know what this is," Naomi said, her voice calm, but carrying steel beneath its softness. "This isn't about safety. Yours about comfort. Yours." He stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You're uncomfortable," she said, "because I didn't answer with a lowered head. Because I didn't ask for your permission to exist here." "It's not what this is about," he muttered. "No," she asked, her tone light but area so white. "Standing here after confirming I live in this house, after verifying my identity. Twice? What exactly are you documenting now?" Fletcher shifted his weight. He glanced back at his cruiser, then down the street. He noticed the curtain twitching in a neighbor's window. A young man across the street held his phone slightly raised, recording silently. "Are you filming?" Fletcher called out. The man didn't answer. He didn't have to. Naomi stepped forward, not aggressively, but purposefully. "Officer, am I under investigation? Am I being detained?" He hesitated. "No, but—" "Then I have the right to end this conversation," she said. "I have the right to go inside my home without harassment." Fletcher's jaw flexed. He hated that word, harassment, but it was starting to fit. "I'm just following up on a report," he said. "And I'm just trying to go inside," Naomi replied. "But you're still in my space. You've made it about more than a report." He straightened, his face hardening into the expression of someone trained to regain control. "You need to calm down, ma'am." Naomi lifted her brows. "Do I sound upset to you?" He said nothing. "Or calm down. That's what people say when they realize someone isn't afraid of them. I'm not shouting. I'm not aggressive. I'm just not shrinking." He looked around again. The neighbor with the phone now had a friend beside him. 2 witnesses, maybe more. "I think we're done here," Naomi said. He didn't answer right away. The pause dragged. Naomi walked back to her lilies, lifted them again with reverence, and stepped toward her door. "You have a good day," she said, without turning around. Fletcher stood frozen for a second, hands still near his belt, but something in the silence, her calm, the eyes watching, the truth she had spoken, broke through the script he had rehearsed. He stepped back. But something had changed in him, too. Officer Fletcher turned toward his cruiser, but his steps lacked the same confidence they'd had when he first approached. The crispness of his stride had faded, replaced with something more hesitant, more self-conscious. The kind of walk a man takes when he realizes he's being watched, not as a protector, but as a potential aggressor. Naomi didn't look back. She placed the lilies carefully in a vase by the window just inside her front door. The lace curtains trembled slightly with the breeze as she parted them, watching Fletcher return to his car. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched. Across the street, the man with the phone lowered it slightly, then spoke to his companion, who nodded. They hadn't filmed out of malice or spectacle. They filmed because it felt necessary, because no one wanted to be the person who said later, "I wish someone had recorded it." Naomi saw them. She nodded once, acknowledging their presence, their protection. Fletcher reached his cruiser and opened the door, but before he got in, he turned and looked back toward the house. Naomi was still watching, her face neutral, her presence unwavering. He got in, the engine turned over, but the car didn't move. It idled, as if he were waiting for something, as if he still hadn't made up his mind whether he was done being the authority in this encounter. Inside the house, Naomi turned from the window. She picked up her Bible from the table, opened it to the worn page she always visited on this day, and sat on the couch. Her heart beat slow and steady. But her spirit was alert. Not afraid, but alert. On the street, a few more neighbors stepped onto their porches, pretending to sweep, to check mail, to do something, anything, that made them visible. They didn't shout or demand. They just stood. The cruiser finally pulled away, but it didn't speed off. It rolled slow, like it had something to prove, or maybe something to forget. Naomi sat quietly with her open Bible. Her fingers traced the verse, not reading it, just remembering it. The house smelled of lilies and old wood, and something sacred that didn't need defending. But she knew better than to think it was over. Because that pause, that moment the officer took before driving off, told her everything. Told her that power never walks away clean. It always leaves something behind. A question, a file, a report framed just wrong enough to matter. She closed the Bible. She stood. She went to the porch and sat in the same spot she always did. And waited. Because sometimes resistance wasn't loud. Sometimes resistance was just not moving. Naomi had just stepped back onto her porch, her fingers barely grazing the handle of her screen door, when she heard the cruiser's engine cut off again behind her. It was a different kind of silence this time. Sharp, deliberate. She didn't turn immediately. Instead, she inhaled deeply, the scent of lilies still lingering on her palms. But she felt it, that shift in the air, the electricity that coils in a storm right before the lightning strikes. She turned slowly, steady as always, expecting more questions, more words, but she wasn't met with words. She was met with force. Officer Fletcher didn't call out her name. He didn't issue a warning or command. He lunged. Naomi saw the blur of his navy uniform just before she felt his grip clamp around her upper arm, tight, unyielding, jarring her entire frame. She stumbled, almost tripping over the porch step, as he yanked her forward. The lilies slipped from her hand in an instant, scattering like wounded birds across the porch. Their stems snapped, petals tore. She reached reflexively for balance, but the Bible in her other hand slid from her fingers and struck the ground with a dull thud. The sound of scripture hitting cement was louder than it should have been. It echoed in Naomi's chest, right beside the thump of her startled heartbeat. "What are you doing?" she gasped, her voice laced with disbelief, more than fear. But Fletcher didn't answer. His eyes were narrow now, his jaw locked. There was no more polite patrolman in his stance. He wasn't investigating anymore. He was taking... Naomi tried to plant her feet, to find solid ground beneath her sandals, but he had already pulled her halfway off the porch, his grip jerking her arm back painfully. The porch rail scraped against her side. She cried out, not loud, but enough for it to ring out on the quiet street like a warning bell. From across the street, the young man with the phone had already stepped forward. Another neighbor, an older woman, with curlers still in her hair, had opened her door wide and was now standing on her lawn, mouth agape. And still Fletcher didn't stop. Naomi twisted, trying to face him, her arm still in his grasp. "Let go of me," she said firmly, her voice now rising, not in panic, but in defense of herself, her body, her name. But he didn't. And the world around them began to move differently. Everything slowed. The white petals on the porch began to settle. The Bible lay face down, its pages fluttering open like wings. A breeze passed through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter stopped short. Naomi's body remembered every march, every sermon, every quiet lesson in dignity and power. But none of it had prepared her for the weight of this man's hand on her body in that moment. And as he dragged her down the porch steps, her neighborhood watched, silent witnesses to a violence they had hoped their town had outgrown. Naomi's sandals scraped against the cement as Fletcher jerked her off the last porch step. Her feet barely caught the edge of the walkway before her back slammed against the red brick of her own home. The blow wasn't hard enough to knock her out, but it was sharp, brutal, the kind that left bone-deep bruises and ghost pains days later. The wall took her breath before Fletcher's forearm did. "Stop resisting," he barked, pressing his arm across her collarbone, elbow angled just enough to catch the tender space beneath her throat. "I'm not resisting," Naomi cried out, hoarse from shock. Her words hit the brick behind her more than they reached him. The brick was hot from the sun, but Fletcher's arm was colder than any metal. Her shoulder ached under his pressure, and her breath grew shallower with each second. She strained to shift her body, just a little, just enough to breathe, but he pinned her without thought, without pause, like she wasn't someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's anything. Across the street, the young man who had been filming stumbled backward a few steps, the camera shaking in his hand. "Oh my God," he muttered, eyes wide. Another neighbor yelled, but the words got caught in the summer air, sticking like humidity to skin. The older woman with the curlers ran back inside, maybe to call someone, maybe to shield herself from the memory being made in front of her. Naomi coughed, the weight on her chest unbearable now. Her hand flew up, instinctively trying to grab the forearm pressing her in place. "You're hurting me," she rasped. Fletcher didn't blink. She tried again, her fingers scratching against his sleeve. Her wedding ring, a gold band worn smooth from 40 years, glinted in the sunlight as she grasped for leverage. For air? For recognition? But all Fletcher saw was a challenge. Not a woman, not a senior citizen, not a grandmother in a floral dress holding lilies minutes earlier. Just a profile, a silhouette, a threat carved from centuries of skewed suspicion. Naomi's legs trembled under her. She wanted to sit, to crouch, to escape, but her back was caught between brick and brutality. She looked past his shoulder, across the street. The boy with the phone was still there, now joined by two more. One filming, one calling someone. Help, maybe. The authorities, ironically. A neighbor. The news. The lilies were scattered across the steps, stems crushed underfoot. One white petal had stuck to the side of Naomi's shoe, fluttering with every trembling motion. And then came a single moment, a beat where Naomi closed her eyes. She inhaled what little she could, not a breath, not really, but enough to call on something older than fear. She opened them again, and in that instant, she didn't just look at Fletcher, she looked through him. Not to intimidate, not to beg, but to let him know, silently, without speaking, that what he was doing would not disappear into silence. This wouldn't vanish, she would not vanish. Time didn't stop, but it bent, slowed, thickened like syrup in the heat. Naomi remained pinned to the brick wall, her chest rising in short, shaky bursts. Officer Fletcher's forearm pressed firm against her upper body, unmoving, unwavering, as though what he held beneath him was not a woman, but an object that had defied its placement, a threat imagined into existence. Across the street, no one moved. Not really. The young man with the phone had lowered it by just an inch, his thumb hovering over the screen, like he wasn't sure if pressing stop meant complicity, or cowardice, or just that he couldn't take watching anymore. His mouth trembled slightly, caught between outrage and nausea. To his left, the woman with her toddler stood frozen on the front lawn. She clutched the child's shoulders tightly, shielding his view with her body. But her own gaze was locked on Naomi, on the grotesque theater unfolding just 30 feet from her hydrangeas. She wanted to scream, to shout the officer's name, but the sound caught in her chest, like she, too, couldn't breathe. Someone shouted finally, "Hey, let her go!" But it came from further down the block, hesitant and half-believed. Fletcher didn't flinch. Naomi pressed into the wall, began to sag, not from surrender, but from physics. Her legs couldn't carry both her weight and the weight of what this had become. This wasn't a stop. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an assault. It was what happens when a black woman is mistaken for less than human. The brick behind her felt harder now, unforgiving. It scraped her skin beneath her dress sleeve, and still, her voice had nowhere to go. No officer had read her any rights. No one had offered an explanation. No crime had been named. Her only offense, it seemed, was walking home from church with too much pride, too much dignity, too much blackness. The Bible lay open, face down on the porch step behind them. The wind tugged at its pages, lifting one, then another, until a verse from Isaiah fluttered into view. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. The words didn't cry out, but they sat heavy in the air, as if the very pages were watching. Naomi's eyes flicked toward the open scripture. Even through blurred vision and strained breath, she saw it. Not the words exactly, but the memory of them, the meaning, the lineage. Fletcher finally spoke, voice low and tight. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Naomi's voice came, but it was barely above a whisper. "No, you are." It wasn't a cry. It wasn't even a protest. It was truth, pressed between ribs and concrete. And that was when everything cracked. Not from Naomi, but from around her. A door slammed across the street. Someone stepped onto the pavement. More phones rose into the air. A teenage girl on a bike dropped her handlebars and stared, mouth agape. The moment had turned. The world had seen. And though Fletcher didn't know it yet, the arrest he thought he was making had already become a reckoning. It began with the shriek of tires, a piercing, undeniable sound that sliced the air like a scream too loud to ignore. A sleek, black SUV tore around the corner, the sun flashing off its hood like a signal flare. It moved with urgency, not recklessness. Controlled, precise, but unyielding. And as it rolled to a stop at the edge of the sidewalk, the whole street seemed to shift. What had been horror became anticipation. What had been silence became warning. Naomi's head tilted slightly, her vision hazy from the chokehold that had only just been released. Her back still burned from the brick. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, but her eyes, those sharp, steady eyes, recognized the sound even before the door swung open. Jeremiah Ellison stepped out like a storm disguised in calm. Dark, tailored slacks, button-down shirt open at the collar, suit jacket clinging to his shoulders like it belonged there more than on any courtroom bench. No badge pinned to his chest, no nameplate around his neck, and yet his presence carried more authority than every siren in that county. He didn't move fast. He didn't need to. Each step from the SUV to the sidewalk hit like punctuation, measured, full of weight. His gaze locked on Naomi, and then flicked to Officer Fletcher, whose hands now hovered awkwardly near his belt. "Step away from my wife," Jeremiah said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The words landed like a verdict. Fletcher blinked. The blood drained from his face in an instant. He looked from Naomi to the man now standing on the curb, confusion clouding his features. His mouth opened slightly, as if to form a word, maybe a protest, maybe an excuse, but nothing came out. He glanced around, seeing what Jeremiah already knew. Half a dozen phones pointed directly at them. Witnesses, eyes, truth. The crowd hadn't moved, not since the moment the SUV arrived. Even the wind had gone still. Naomi stood straighter, her shoulders pulling back despite the ache spreading across her spine. Her dress was wrinkled, the lilies she'd carried now trampled underfoot, and yet, there she was, whole, present, seen. And Jeremiah? He wasn't done. He took one step closer, closing the distance between the law and the line that had just been crossed. "You've got about 3 seconds to do the right thing," he said, his tone still quiet, but infused with something electric. 3 seconds, officer." Fletcher hesitated. His authority had cracked, but his ego hadn't caught up. He looked back at Naomi, then at Jeremiah, then at the crowd. Still, he didn't move. 2, Jeremiah said, this time with steel threaded through the calm. That was when the shift happened, not just in Fletcher, but in everyone watching. The kind of shift that says, the old rules no longer apply. That power has arrived not with violence, but with clarity. not to dominate, but to expose. And just like that, the next moment held its breath. Fletcher's hands twitched at his sides. For a split second, he looked like he might double down, but like the weight of his badge could still justify what had just happened. But then he saw it, the certainty in Jeremiah Ellison's eyes, a calm, immovable truth that refused to blink. The kind of presence that didn't even need backup, that didn't have to shout, that had already won. Jeremiah stepped forward again, slow and deliberate, closing the gap between them to just a few feet. "You're done here," he said, voice low and clear. "Remove yourself from this sidewalk, or I'll have the Department Internal Affairs and your union president all on this within the hour." Fletcher's face tightened. His mouth opened again, this time forming the beginning of a protest. But still, no sound came. He saw the phone still pointed in his direction, the quiet fury gathering in the air, and something inside him caved. He stepped back, one foot, then another. Naomi exhaled slowly. Her body didn't relax, couldn't yet, but she shifted slightly, her weight redistributing as her chest found rhythm again. The brick behind her no longer held her hostage. She looked to Jeremiah, and their eyes locked. A silent conversation passed between them in an instant. "I'm here," his look said. "I see you. I've got..." Jeremiah moved to her side. He didn't touch her, not yet, but his nearness was enough to draw a protective boundary around her. The kind that said, "No one crosses this line again." The crowd on the sidewalk started to murmur now. Words like, "What the hell was that?" and "Did you see him choke her?" drifted on the summer air. A few people lowered their phones, uncertain if the danger had passed or merely shifted form. That was when Fletcher did something no one expected. He turned. With a stiff, almost mechanical motion, he began to walk away, not back to his cruiser, but toward the edge of the block where his partner had been stationed earlier. The posture of command was gone. What remained was something smaller, deflated. Jeremiah watched him go but didn't move. His attention was still on Naomi. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice now tinged with something else. Concern, yes, but also restraint. The kind of anger that simmers quietly, waiting for the right place to boil. Naomi nodded. "Yes," she said. Her voice was raspy but unbroken. Jeremiah reached a hand toward her now, open palm, no pressure. She took it, steadying herself. Together they stepped away from the wall, of her legs shaky but purposeful. The heels of her shoes clicked softly on the pavement, reclaiming space that had been taken without cause. And the crowd parted. Phones dropped to sides, eyes followed them, not just in awe, but in reverence. They had just witnessed power, not the kind that comes with guns or uniforms, but the kind that arrives with truth, love, and the unshakable weight of justice. They didn't speak for the first few steps. The crowd stayed silent too, still wrapped in the gravity of what they'd just witnessed. Naomi walked with slow, deliberate grace, arm linked with Jeremiah's now, her hand steady against his. Her Bible, still on the ground a few feet behind them, lay open with its pages rustling softly in the breeze. A young boy in the crowd, no older than 10, ran forward, gently picked it up, and placed it reverently in her hands. She nodded to him, gratitude etched into her tired smile. Jeremiah turned toward Fletcher's cruiser, now sitting idle at the curb. The passenger door was ajar, the radio still hissing with ambient chatter from Central Dispatch. But no other officer came to intervene. No command presence arrived to regain control. For the first time in that encounter, silence favored justice. From across the street, someone called out, "That's the judge!" It wasn't shouted, not really. It was more like revelation spoken aloud, confirmation of what many had already begun to suspect. Another voice followed, "That's his wife." And just like that, the pieces clicked together in public consciousness. Not just a woman harassed, not just a black elder choked on the sidewalk, but Naomi Ellison, the wife of the man who held court in the very town where this had just happened. The town that now watched itself in the mirror and didn't like what stared back. Jeremiah turned to face the crowd fully now, his hand still on Naomi's back. "I want every one of you to remember what you saw today," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried clear, calm, and impossible to ignore. Because some people will try to say it didn't happen like that. They'll say she was uncooperative, that he feared for his safety. He glanced down at Naomi, then back at them. "But you were here. You saw it. So don't let them forget." A woman in the back raised her phone again. "We won't," she said. Naomi turned then, for the first time since the chokehold, and addressed the crowd herself. "I've lived in this city for 38 years," she said. "I taught Sunday school. I marched for voting rights. I have always obeyed the law. And still," she touched the bruise forming near her neck, "still, I became a threat." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. It held the kind of strength that comes from knowing you did nothing wrong, and that the world had just seen proof. The moment settled like a seal pressed into wax, permanent. Jeremiah turned toward their SUV, his arms still around Naomi. He opened the passenger door for her, waited until she was inside, then walked to the driver's side. Before he got in, he looked once more at the stunned officer standing at the edge of the sidewalk. Fletcher, now barely recognizable, beneath the collapse of his posture. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He just looked. And Fletcher turned away. The SUV pulled off slow, its taillights fading around the corner. But the silence it left behind would echo for days. The air buzzed, not with sirens, but with the soft, electric hum of recording phones catching history mid-breath. All around Naomi and Jeremiah, the crowd that had once watched in stunned silence now found its voice in the form of glowing screens. Dozens of hands held phones aloft, capturing every angle, every moment, every tremble of Naomi's bruised shoulders, and every syllable of Naomi's unwavering demands. From teenagers in hoodies to church mothers with programs still tucked in their purses, the witnesses became archivists of truth. There would be no forgetting, no twisting, not this time. A woman in the front, dressed in a yellow head wrap and holding her baby against her chest, whispered as she filmed, "They need to see this. All of them. Everyone." And she wasn't alone. The clip would be uploaded in seconds, titled with heartbreak, "Racist Cop Attacks Elderly Black Woman After Church." Others would call it "Sunday Morning Assault," or "This is Why We Don't Feel Safe." The titles would vary, but the images would stay the same, raw, gutting, irrefutable. Naomi didn't notice all the phones at first. Her vision was still slightly blurred, the adrenaline still wearing off. But she felt it. The eyes that had once judged her presence now watched her pain with growing outrage. The same community that had once kept to themselves now held digital torches, lighting a path toward justice that could no longer be ignored. Jeremiah moved with precision. He stepped away from Naomi only far enough to face the retreating figure of Officer Fletcher, who still lingered on the periphery like a man trying to remember where his authority had gone. "Ye," Jeremiah called, sharp but even. "Name, badge number, right now." So Fletcher stopped in his tracks. His hand went to the badge pinned to his chest, more reflex than pride. He glanced toward his cruiser, then at the phones, then at Jeremiah, who stood tall, not as a husband anymore, but as something larger, a judge, a black man with power, a witness who wasn't going to let this slide. The officer muttered something low, almost swallowed, but Jeremiah stepped closer. "Say it louder. For the record, for the people watching." Fletcher's jaw clenched. "Officer Thomas Fletcher, badge number 7681. Jeremiah nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. "You'll be hearing from my office." It wasn't a threat, it was a guarantee. The crowd murmured louder now, energized by the shift. One teenager zoomed in on Fletcher's face, narrating his video in real time. "This the man who put his arm on a grandma's neck? This the face?" Another woman said, "How you choke somebody with a Bible in their hand? What kind of monster does that?" The phones didn't just record, they multiplied. One person shared to Facebook, another to Instagram, a third to TikTok with a caption that read, "Imagine this was your mother." Within moments, the digital tide began its surge. Jeremiah didn't look back. His eyes remained fixed on Fletcher like a man staring through a locked door, knowing exactly what lay behind it. With the name and badge number now spoken aloud and recorded, there was no undoing it. This wasn't a moment tucked away in a dark alley or hidden behind courthouse red tape. This was evidence, etched in pixels and witnesses, and no procedural shield could erase it. Then came the sound that made everyone's heads turn. The crunch of tires over gravel, slower than a siren, heavier than a whisper. A new cruiser rolled up from the side street and came to a halt. Its doors didn't fly open in dramatic flair. Instead, they creaked with reluctant duty, and from the driver's side stepped Sergeant Linda Kessler. Kessler was in her late 40s, pale, faded, and composed. The kind of officer who had long learned how to maintain the illusion of control, even when it was slipping like sand through her fingers. Her eyes scanned the scene. "Report came through dispatch," she said, her voice even. "Unclear what happened, just catching up." Jeremiah turned, his jaw tightening. "Then let me clarify for you." Kessler nodded slowly, stepping closer. Naomi was seated on a nearby bench now, her hand resting gently on her chest, her Bible still cradled beside her like armor. Her eyes met Kessler's for a moment. Not accusing, not fully. "Home from church," Jeremiah began, his voice calm but full of weight. "No disturbance, no threat. And your officer," he motioned toward Fletcher, "solve her, threw her against a wall, pressed his arm into her throat." Gasps, audible ones. Even those who had witnessed the act seemed stunned to hear it put into such blunt, unforgiving terms. Kessler glanced toward Fletcher, whose eyes darted to the ground. "Is that true?" she asked, voice sharp. "Now?" Fletcher didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just stood there, mute, beneath the glare of accountability. Kessler turned to Jeremiah. "We will conduct an internal—" "No, JFKD. You don't get to conduct anything in silence anymore. There were witnesses, videos. My wife has a bruise on her neck." He pointed to the phones. "The public already knows, and you will answer publicly." That was when Naomi finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced through the air like scripture read at a funeral. "Is this what protection looks like now?" Kessler turned, eyes softening despite herself. "Ma'am, I'm—" "Don't say sorry," Naomi interrupted, her voice as steady as it was tired. "Say, you'll stop him from doing it again." Kessler paused. The air thickened. No procedural handbook could guide her through this moment. She could feel the old frame of law enforcement cracking beneath the weight of lived truth and viral proof. She reached for her radio. "Dispatch," she said. "Put Officer Fletcher on administrative leave, effective immediately." There was no cheer, no applause, just breath held tight in every chest, as if the town itself couldn't believe what had just been said aloud. Officer Fletcher stiffened, his eyes wide and glassy. For a man used to barking orders, his silence now felt like punishment he didn't know how to process. Naomi didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply looked away, toward the maple trees lining the sidewalk, their branches gently swaying like they knew something ancient was shifting. The crowd parted as Sergeant Kessler stepped aside to radio and the rest. Jeremiah returned to Naomi's side, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. "I'm still here." He helped her to her feet with gentle hands, not as a husband shielding a wife, but as a man witnessing a storm that refused to sweep her away. The phones kept filming, none of them had stopped, and now many had begun uploading. A few feet away, a young woman tapped her screen. "It's live now," she whispered, "already getting comments." Another boy muttered, "Yo, it's on Twitter. 5,000 views in 10 minutes. The story had slipped beyond the sidewalk, beyond the town. It had entered the bloodstream of a nation that had seen too many videos like this before, but still couldn't look away. Across the digital world, the headlines started to take form. Elderly, a loaded black woman assaulted by cop, judge husband arrives just in time. Racist cop chokes grandmother leaving church. Didn't know she was a judge's wife. And bruises. The Sunday morning America can't ignore. The imagery was too raw, the context too powerful. Naomi, with lilies crushed in her hand. Jeremiah, ensued in fire, demanding accountability. Fletcher, frozen under the weight of his own actions. And behind it all, a town watching itself change. Sergeant Kessler walked back toward them, more composed now, but visibly rattled. "I've notified the department," she said to Jeremiah. "They'll expect your statement and your footage." Jeremiah gave a curt nod. "They'll get it." She looked at Naomi then, lowering her voice. "I'm sorry." This time, Naomi let the words sit, let the weight of them pass without interruption. Then she said, "It's not your apology I need, it's your consistency." Kessler didn't argue. As Jeremiah guided Naomi toward their SUV, the crowd slowly dispersed. Not with relief, but with resolve. Some were still filming, narrating the moment for followers. Others just walked in silence, phones in hand, already typing captions that would spread across platforms like Wire. One last voice rang out from the back. "We saw it. The world saw it. Now what are they going to do about it?" That question wouldn't disappear. It would rise, echo, demand. And for once, maybe this time, it would be answered. By the time the footage had reached every social platform and made its way into the early morning news cycle, the sheriff's personal cell phone was already ringing. He stared at the caller ID. Ah, Jeremiah Ellison, and knew instinctively that whatever was on the other end wasn't going to be smoothed over with statements or spin. Sheriff Wayne Braddock had been in law enforcement for 32 years. He had weathered his share of storms, misconduct allegations, budget hearings, even civil suits, but none had come wrapped in this kind of clarity. A judge's wife assaulted, video evidence flooding the internet, and the perpetrator still in a uniform when the first clip hit 50,000 views. He picked up with a gravel-voiced, "Judge." Jeremiah didn't waste time. "I trust you've seen the footage." "I have. I also trust you understand that administrative leave is not enough." There was a pause. Braddock knew the man on the other end was not just speaking as a grieving husband, but as a federal judge, someone who knew the machinery of justice well enough to unbolt it piece by piece. "Internal Affairs is already looking into it," the sheriff replied. "But I need to ask, do you intend to press charges?" "I intend," Jeremiah said slowly, "to make sure this department either reforms or rots in full public view." That was enough. Braddock knew the cameras were still rolling, even if he couldn't see them. He promised full cooperation, ended the call, and immediately summoned Internal Affairs, the county's legal counsel, and his public affairs officer. By 10 o'clock IEM, Officer Thomas Doyle, whose badge number had become a viral hashtag overnight, was officially suspended without pay, pending an investigation that was now moving faster than the department had ever experienced. The press release came next. Drafted with input from half a dozen risk managers, it read like all crisis statements do: measured, distant, apologetic, but without admitting fault. Still, the public saw through it. They always did. But Naomi wasn't watching. The world was watching, but not every moment. Naomi sat quietly in the living room of their modest home, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady on the muted television. The room glowed softly in the early morning light, a gentle calm over everything. But inside, the storm of voices, media anchors, social feeds, endless debate. She hadn't spoken publicly. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more than any statement could, richer than any tweet. By choosing restraint, she made room for dignity. While the world exploded in outrage, criticism, and fevered speculation. It wasn't weakness, it was power. Outside, a hush had settled on the front porch. Neighbors, reporters, and curious passers-by paused just beyond their gate. They watched shadows move behind curtains, tried to glimpse the bruises she wouldn't show, searched for answers hidden in silence. But Naomi offered them nothing. Not yet. Nearby, in their home office, Jeremiah had taken command. His phone hummed constantly. Calls from civil rights groups, journalists, legal analysts. A former colleague from the Bar Association pushed him toward a public statement. He hesitated. He remembered Naomi's quiet strength and the way her voice had cut through the night before. "We don't need permission to tell the truth." So he drafted nothing. Instead, he set his focus on what he could influence. He called a meeting with his administrative assistant and began forwarding emails to the sheriff's office and internal affairs. Each forwarded message bore a clear directive. Need updates. Timeline. Names involved. Civil rights lawyer consulted. He opened his laptop and typed the subject line, Policy Review Proposal. Inside, he laid out changes he wanted. Mandatory body cam activation, community oversight, anti-bias training beyond cursory lectures, real, funded change. He imagined those reforms mirrored not just in their city, but across the state, maybe the country. He saw not headlines, but broken systems reimagined through accountability. And behind each reform stood Naomi, her name unspoken in press releases, but always present in the heart of his mission. Back in the living room, Naomi rose from the couch and walked to the window. Outside, an elderly neighbor waved discreetly. A teenager looked at his phone, ashamed. A neighbor moved away, embarrassed or supportive. It was hard to distinguish. But the problem, Naomi knew, wasn't just this street corner. It was every place people like her had once believed safety was a right, only to have it tested by suspicion. She exhaled slowly and returned to the couch. She picked up her Bible, opened to the psalm she'd paused on, the one about faith in hard times. She read softly, letting the words root her. Her phone buzzed with messages from family and old students, proud notes and tears. She didn't read them all. She didn't need to. Jeremiah entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He approached her, tension coiled beneath measured composure. He knelt beside her on the couch and laid his hand over hers. "What are we going to do?" she asked, voice low but firm, bracing the weight of everything they had witnessed. "We're going to hold the line," he replied. "Not just for the moment, but for the next time, and the time after. We're going to make this hurt, but also mean something." She nodded once. Not a show of strength, but an affirmation, a pact. They had entered this together. Neither silence nor fame would define the aftermath. Instead, they would define the path forward. At that moment, a text came through on Jeremiah's phone. It was a link to the newly released body cam policy draft from the sheriff's own office. Punctual, prepared, but still superficial. He showed it to her. "It's a start," he said, "but not nearly enough." She tapped the screen, eyes steady. "Then, we keep pushing." And in that living room, with the morning light steadier, softer, they planned. They planned a press conference not to defend, but to declare. A town hall, not for optics, but for accountability. A pathway forward built on actual change, not momentary outrage, but sustained action. Because justice, real justice, was never just a headline. It was hard, it was slow, it was relentless. And Naomi Ellison had decided she wasn't leaving until it took hold. The days that followed did not bring clarity. They brought fracture. Meadow Ridge, once a quiet southern town that prided itself on neighborly smiles and Sunday stillness, was now a crucible. Conversations that had long simmered below the surface erupted across front porches, barbershops, and church parking lots. People spoke in hushed tones and raised voices, depending on which side of history they thought they stood on. In cafes, white patrons muttered about overreaction and misunderstanding, their discomfort thinly veiled as concern. In black churches, pastors rewrote sermons overnight, calling out what had happened by name: racism, profiling, assault, and urging their congregations to stay vocal, visible, and vigilant. The footage continued to circulate. Commentators from both coasts weighed in. Civil rights activists praised Naomi's composure and condemned Officer Doyle's actions. Conservative bloggers warned about trial by internet, but what no one could deny was that the community had been forced to confront itself. A Facebook group titled Justice for Naomi swelled to 20,000 members. A countergroup emerged, Support Our Officers, led in part by the wife of a retired deputy, who insisted that good men are being vilified. And in the middle of it all stood Jeremiah. He moved through the fire with purpose, meeting with the city manager, speaking on panels, attending school board discussions, where even teenagers wanted to talk about what it meant to walk home while black. He was tired, always tired, but driven by something more than anger. He was building pressure that didn't scream but insisted. Naomi continued to stay out of the spotlight, not because she was retreating, but because she knew her role. Jeremiah was the voice. She was the symbol. Their strategy was unspoken, seamless. And the more she stayed silent, the louder the conversation grew around her. She watched from the porch as protesters walked past her house, some holding signs with her name, some just nodding in quiet solidarity as they passed. Others came to see her, to pray in her yard, to sit for a moment on the same sidewalk where she had been choked. They left flowers, candles, even handwritten notes. But not everyone came with kindness. One morning she found a note slipped under her door. No return address, no name, just 2 words scribbled in black ink: "Stay silent." She held it in her hands for a moment, then calmly fed it into the fireplace. The flames took it without hesitation. That same night, Jeremiah hosted a closed-door meeting at the local community center, inviting faith leaders, lawyers, and civic organizers. He laid out what came next: a formal request for a Department of Justice inquiry, state law reform proposals, and a city charter amendment for civilian oversight of the police. It wasn't enough to suspend one officer. The entire mechanism had to be rebuilt or replaced. And for every voice that shouted back, "This is too far," Jeremiah had one answer. "You didn't see her face against that wall. I did." The words landed like thunder. And in that moment, even those who hadn't chosen a side before began to understand that neutrality was no longer an option. This wasn't just a viral moment, it was a reckoning. And it had only just begun. What happened to Naomi Ellison was no longer an isolated incident. It became the match that lit every corner of Meadow Ridge, revealing stories that had been hidden, silenced, or shrugged off for years. And now those stories were coming out, flooding in, pouring over every digital feed, whispered from porches, shouted in schools, handed over in late-night emails with shaking fingers. A teenager named Jordan came forward first, 14, soft-spoken, known for keeping to himself. He wore a hoodie in the winter, nothing unusual, nothing rebellious, but he remembered the night he was stopped, pushed against a chain-link fence, and asked if he was carrying. His only crime was walking too slowly on his own street. His story made its way to the local paper. Then came more. An elderly man named Wallace, 82 years old, shared a handwritten letter during a church meeting. He'd been stopped leaving the pharmacy, his cane mistaken for suspicious behavior, his bag searched, while a younger officer stood by, laughing. The humiliation still clung to his bones, and for years he had said nothing. Naomi read each story. She read them not as shock, but as confirmation. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. But now, people were no longer content to survive. They wanted transformation. They wanted protection. They wanted what Naomi had long believed in, accountability that didn't wait until someone was bleeding, filmed, or gone. Despite the pressure to speak, Naomi continued to decline all interview requests. Every national outlet had come calling, daytime talk shows, evening news segments, podcast hosts offering entire episodes to amplify her voice. But Naomi declined, again and again. She wasn't trying to be elusive. She was being intentional. This wasn't about celebrity, it was about change. And change didn't happen in bright studios or viral soundbites. It happened in policy drafts, community meetings, and pressure campaigns. So while the world wanted her face, Naomi gave them something else, her purpose. With Jeremiah beside her, she began helping local organizers plan a town hall. They wouldn't hold it in a city building or government hall. They chose the courthouse steps. Symbolic, visible, public. It wasn't just about speaking truth. It was about making sure that truth stood exactly where it had once been ignored. On the day of the town hall, the courthouse lawn swelled with people. A sea of folding chairs stretched across the concrete and onto the grass. Some held signs. Justice starts local. Ask Naomi, not your newsfeed. We are all watching. Others simply came to listen. The crowd wasn't just black or white. It was old and young. Teachers, students, shop owners, church members, janitors, lawyers. Naomi noticed familiar faces she hadn't seen in years. People who had once looked away now looked forward, and that was its own kind of reckoning. Jeremiah opened the meeting with simple words. This is not about one officer. It's about every pattern that allowed that officer to believe what he did was okay. Then he stepped aside, and Naomi, for the first time since the incident, walked to the mic. She wore no makeup, no prepared speech, no entourage. Just her dove brooch and a small folded piece of paper in her palm. I've heard people say I should be proud, she began softly. But pride is not the right word for what I feel. It doesn't belong to me alone. This belongs to all of us who've walked home and wondered if our peace was allowed. To every elder who said nothing to stay safe. To every child who learned too early how to keep their hands visible. The crowd was silent. You could hear the breeze move through the trees behind them. I don't want statues or headlines, she continued. I want structures that outlive my name. I want my grandchildren to ask why things used to be this way, not why they still are. Applause followed, not erupting but rising like a wave, not just admiration, but alignment. That night, the town voted to form a civilian oversight committee for the local police department. Naomi and Jeremiah were nominated to co-chair it. They accepted, not for recognition, but because there was no alternative. As the meeting concluded, an older white man, Mr. Reynolds, retired school principal, approached Naomi. I saw what happened, he said, voice gravelly with age, and I knew I should have come forward sooner. But I was scared, not of them, of what that silence made me. Naomi didn't offer comfort or correction. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder. Then speak now, while it still matters. And he nodded, because it did. By week's end, the Civilian Oversight Board had been officially established. What started as a conversation, painful, public, and overdue, was now written into city record. Meadow Ridge, for the first time in its 135-year history, had civilian eyes watching the bad. The board was composed of 11 members, 4 appointed by city officials, 4 nominated by the public, 3, including Naomi and Jeremiah, added as legacy advocates, a term the community insisted upon. It wasn't just about experience, it was about lived survival. They met in the old municipal building, a place long relegated to dusty permit paperwork and forgotten archives. But now it hummed with life. Folding chairs were replaced with circle seating. Bulletin boards once filled with faded announcements were covered in community artwork and mission statements. One of them read in hand-drawn cursive, "We remember." Their first meetings were hard. Procedural jargon clashed with raw testimony. Naomi listened, always deeply. She let people speak even when they wandered, paused when emotions rose, and gently steered the conversation back to solutions. They reviewed body cam policies, suspension protocols, complaint response time. They debated use of force thresholds, officer retraining guidelines, transparency metrics. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And through it all, Naomi sat with her hands folded, her dove brooch pinned just above her heart. She wasn't there for spectacle. She was there for permanence. Late one evening, after a long session filled with pushback from union representatives, Jeremiah asked her quietly, "Do you ever wonder if it's enough? Just this room, these rules?" Naomi didn't look at him. She looked out the window where the courthouse steps still held the ghosts of raised voices and fragile hope. "No," she said, "but it's how enough begins." That answer settled over him like the dusk, soft, certain, and undeniable. By the end of that month, Officer Doyle's termination was upheld. The Sheriff's Department introduced mandatory cultural competency training. A quarterly town report on police conduct was launched. None of it was revolutionary on its own, but stitched together, it began to feel like a garment the community could finally wear with dignity. Naomi didn't celebrate with speeches. She didn't pop champagne or post on social media. She went home, watered her lilies, folded laundry, and sat on her porch. And as the evening light stretched across her front yard, she noticed something small but unmistakable. A teenager walking home, hoodie up, earbuds in, unbothered. No sidelong glances, no cruisers crawling behind, no questions asked. Naomi exhaled, slow and deep. Because that was the change. It didn't shout, it didn't strut, it simply walked home. Unharmed. Naomi stood in front of her hallway mirror, lifting the soft linen sleeve that covered her arm. The bruise had darkened overnight, taking on a deep maroon shade along her upper shoulder. It wasn't the color that hurt, it was the memory it carried. A man's arm, the weight of the wall against her back, the sound of her Bible hitting the concrete, all of it lived there under her skin. She gently pulled the sleeve back down and turned from the mirror. The house felt heavier now, not from fear, not even from sorrow, just the gravity of having lived through something the world insisted still needed proof. Outside, the porch creaked under her steps. She lowered herself slowly into the rocking chair that had carried her through marriage, motherhood, and mourning. The lilies by the door had bloomed again. She hadn't replaced them since that day. They had held on as she had, despite being crushed. Jeremiah had gone quiet since the announcement. The promotion offer sat unopened on the coffee table. Naomi hadn't asked. She knew the look in his eyes when he passed it, like he was walking past a wound he didn't know how to dress. It wasn't just a job, it was a crossroads. Accepting meant stepping deeper into a system that had turned on them. Refusing meant forfeiting the power to change it from within. There was no clean choice, no pure path. A neighbor passed by and waved gently. Naomi returned the wave, her face soft, measured. Ever since the incident, people had approached her with reverence, some offering casseroles, others handing her letters folded neatly into envelopes, addressed with shaky hands and apologizingly laced, hand-lowered. A few, mostly white neighbors, had avoided her entirely, their silence more telling than anything they might have said. Naomi didn't seek vengeance. She didn't hunger for headlines. But what she could not accept, what she would never forgive, was the suggestion that this could all be moved past without honest reckoning. She ran her fingers across the armrest of her chair, feeling the grain of the wood. This porch had seen history. It had heard laughter and grief, quiet mornings and hard conversations. And now, it had become part of something bigger. Something painful, yes, but also permanent. That permanence settled on her shoulders like a shawl. Not warm, not cold, just true. And truth, she had learned long ago, was never light. Jeremiah Ellison sat at the dining room table, untouched coffee cooling in his cup, promotion letter still sealed on the table in front of him. The morning sun cut through the blinds, casting bars of light across the hardwood floor. Her lines, he couldn't help but notice, resembled the ones inside a holding cell. He had worked his entire life for this moment. Decades in law, years on the bench, a reputation built on integrity, clarity, justice. And now, after what had happened to Naomi, they wanted him to lead reform, to be the face of a new era, a symbol of transformation. But it felt hollow. The offer didn't come from a place of recognition. It came from fear, from damage control, from a system scrambling to save face before more footage dropped, before the town could fully see its reflection in the viral mirror Naomi's assault had become. He picked up the letter again, read the first few lines. "We believe your leadership can help restore public trust." The words tasted like ash. He didn't want trust. He wanted truth. And truth meant acknowledging that his wife, his Naomi, had been brutalized just feet from their home, that her face had been pressed against a wall while a nation claimed it had learned from history. Footsteps approached. Naomi entered the room, holding a folded tea towel in one hand and a look of quiet certainty in the other. "You're still staring at it," she said, nodding toward the envelope. "I don't know what to do," he said, rubbing his temple. "If I say yes, it feels like I'm letting them bury what happened. If I say no, I lose the chance to fix it from the inside." Naomi walked over and sat across from him, the towel in her lap now, her hands folded, calm but firm. "Do you remember what you said to me after my mother died?" she asked. Jeremiah blinked. "I told you the world didn't stop for our grief." She nodded. "And I told you, maybe it should, just long enough to remember what matters." Silence filled the space between them. Then Naomi leaned forward. "This isn't about what they want, it's about what you're willing to carry. Because if you say yes, you don't get to forget. You don't get to distance yourself. You stay here. You fight. You make it impossible for them to pretend none of this happened." Jeremiah looked at her, at the woman who had endured so much, who bore her bruises like silent medals, not for glory, but for truth. And in that moment, he understood. Saying yes wouldn't be an escape, it would be a vow. He picked up the envelope. This time he opened it. By the end of the week, headlines were everywhere. Judge Ellison accepts reform mandate amid public outcry. Brutality caught on camera. Town divided over officers' conduct. Naomi Ellison declines interviews. Sites focus on justice, not fame. The town's mood had shifted. You could feel it in the pauses between sentences, in the sidewise glances exchanged in grocery store aisles. Some officers resigned before policy changes took effect. Others stayed bitter, whispering about betrayal and pressure. Still, others reached out quietly, privately, thanking Jeremiah for doing what they couldn't say aloud. At home, Naomi returned to the porch. Her bruises had faded, but she still moved with care. She no longer flinched at the sound of sirens. But each time she passed the brick wall, her breath caught for a moment. Not fear, just memory. She watched the neighborhood with her same quiet vigilance. Children rode bikes. Long sprinklers ticked softly. The rhythm of normalcy was returning, but it returned with new edges. Letters arrived every day, some anonymous, some signed. Notes of gratitude, apologies. One envelope held only a photo of her, torn from the footage, with the words, "Because of you, I see my grandmother differently." She folded that one carefully and kept it in her Bible. One evening, as the sky turned orange, Jeremiah joined her. He sat beside her on the porch, neither speaking for a while. Just the creak of the old chair, the hush of wind through leaves. "Do you think it'll last?" he asked finally. Naomi tilted her head. "The change?" He nodded. "Change isn't a wave," she said. "It's a tide. Comes in, pulls back, leaves marks. And even if it pulls away for a while, the coastline's never the same." Jeremiah took a long breath, settling into that truth. "It's strange," he said. "I've handed down sentences my whole life, But this feels heavier. Because it's not about punishment, Naomi replied softly. It's about remembering. He turned toward her. What do you mean? She looked out at the street. I didn't need him to lose his job. I needed people to stop pretending women like me don't exist. I needed that officer to see me, really see me, before his hands found my throat. The light dimmed. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, then added, and I needed you to lead, not just with the law, but with memory, with everything this porch has seen. Jeremiah reached over and took her hand. It was small, still healing, but steady. No fanfare, no headlines, just the two of them, carrying the weight of what had happened and what might still come. Together they sat in the quiet. Not because the storm had passed, but because they had decided to stay through it. It was the kind of day Meadowville was known for. Sunlight filtered through tall oaks, casting leafy shadows on the sidewalks. The hum of lawnmowers rolled in waves across backyards. Children darted between sprinklers, shrieking with laughter. Porch fans spun lazily. It was quiet, not because nothing had happened, but because so much had. Naomi sat on her porch again, not quite in the same way as before. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, the Bible beside her, lilies in a fresh vase behind her. The same rocking chair creaked under her, but its rhythm carried a new weight. Not heaviness from trauma, but from presence, an undeniable sense that something had been anchored, claimed, lest indelible. Across the street, the neighbor's daughter waved. Naomi returned it with a soft smile. That child used to stare and then look away. Now, she waved. A jogger passed, a white man in his 30s. He slowed as he came near Naomi's house, nodding slightly. Not the performative nod of someone trying to be seen doing the right thing, but one shaped by awareness. She nodded back. She didn't need more than that. Recognition wasn't the same as redemption, but it was a start. The silence around Naomi was not the empty kind. It was the silence after a storm, when the wreckage is surveyed, when breath is finally allowed. It was the silence that asked, now that you've seen, what will you do? Inside the house, Jeremiah stood behind the living room window, watching her. He didn't interrupt. There were moments she needed to be alone with the world. And this porch, this sacred space of hers, was the one place that held every version of Naomi she'd ever been. The teenager who wrote poems in the margins of her Bible, young mother who clutched their daughter close after news of another lynching, the woman who smiled through chemotherapy, the survivor of brutality who'd stayed seated not out of weakness, but resolve. This porch had borne witness. It had endured. And now, it was something more. That stillness outside, it wasn't just peace. It was legacy in motion. Jeremiah stepped outside, easing the screen door shut behind him. He carried 2 mugs of tea, one in each hand, and offered one to Naomi as he took the seat beside her. She accepted it with a small nod of thanks, lifting it gently to her lips. The two of them sat like that for a while. No rush to speak, no pressure to fill the quiet. Eventually, Jeremiah turned to her. "Do you think," he asked, his voice low, "they see you differently now?" Naomi didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the street, the birds on the telephone wire, the child drawing chalk stars on the sidewalk, the breeze lifting the corner of a neighbor's flag. Then she said, without turning her head, "Some do." Jeremiah waited, knowing more would come. Silence. "That," she added, a slow exhale following. She looked over at him then, the lines on her face etched deeper by time, but no less beautiful. "And some," she said quietly, "never will." Jeremiah nodded, already expecting that part of the answer. "Now," Naomi finished, "they don't get to look away." There was no bitterness in her voice, no victory either, just truth. That, in the end, was her gift. Not anger, not vengeance, just the kind of honesty that reshaped the air around her. He thought about everything that had followed: the officer suspended, the oversight board forming, the community shifting. It had been hard fought and not nearly enough. He'd been offered a position on the state's Judicial Reform Council, a prestigious title, more influence, but with it came distance, less connection, more red tape, less porch. He hadn't answered yet, not because he didn't know what he wanted, but because he did. He glanced sideways at his mother, who was watching the sky now, where a cloud moved across the sun. Light filtered again in uneven patches. "I want to stay here," he said aloud. Naomi turned to him. "I think I need to," he continued. "I've spent my whole life believing change comes from the top down, but maybe it starts right here, in the places they think don't matter." Naomi nodded slowly. "That's what they always forget," she murmured. "Change doesn't knock. It grows roots, quietly, under the porch, between the bricks." He smiled. She sipped her tea again and said, "You don't have to fix it all, just make it impossible to ignore." Jeremiah let that sink in. That porch, this conversation, held more clarity than any courtroom ever had. He looked out at the street, where the echoes of her words would live long after they were spoken. They didn't need microphones or gavel strikes. They had this: a porch, a chair, a woman who would not be moved, and a son who finally understood the true weight of stillness. As the sun dipped lower, Naomi set her mug down on the porch rail. Her fingers lingered on the warm ceramic for a moment before she stood up slowly. Jeremiah moved to assist her, but she waved him off gently. This moment was hers. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked out over the block, her kingdom. It hadn't always been kind to her. It hadn't always been safe, but it was hers, and it knew her weight. The boards beneath her feet creaked in familiar greeting. From this perch, she had seen the world turn, had watched children become leaders, watched loved ones leave and never return, had watched a country stumble and promise and stumble again. And yet, here she stood. "I saw myself," she said softly, to no one in particular. That's what mattered. She didn't need applause, didn't need headlines or statues. She had lived a life that left echoes, and the echo was truth. Jeremiah joined her, silent. He didn't want to disturb the quiet. He simply stood beside her, one hand gently resting on the railing. His presence said everything. Behind them the house was still. The wind chimes whispered above the doorway. Somewhere down the street someone was grilling. Laughter rolled from a backyard. Life was continuing, but it was continuing differently now. On porches all across Meadowville, conversations were happening. About truth, about justice, about what it means to see someone and not just pass by. Naomi's story had done more than stir emotions. It had shifted the weight of awareness. Jeremiah watched his mother slowly lower herself back into her rocking chair. She gripped the armrests and settled in with the grace of someone reclaiming a throne. A porch light flickered on above her head, automatic, simple, illuminating her face in gold. Then stillness. The kind that holds, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. From the street, her silhouette was framed like a memory someone would tell their grandchildren about. That's where the woman sat. That's where she refused to move. That's where the town changed. Jeremiah didn't say goodbye when he walked down the steps. He would be back tomorrow, and the day after. He would continue what she had started, not with noise, but with presence. And as the night gathered, the porch remained lit. The chair rocked once, then stilled. But the stillness didn't mean silence. It meant history had left its mark. And now, the world could no longer look away.